finish up the verses in Daniel 11 that we can study tonight. We did 32 last week, and we're going to look at 33 through that last verse in this section, which would be verse 35. The end of verse 32, if you'll be opening up your Bibles to that, and we'll need Maccabees as well, of course. We'll need Maccabees a lot now for the next few weeks. The end of Daniel 11 and verse 32 must describe evidently the very early part of the resistance, the Jewish resistance movement. When we read that the people who know their God will be strong and do exploits. And this part of the verse would be seen, its fulfillment would be seen in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, which is what we read, I think, the entire thing last time. We concentrated there. 1 Maccabees 2, where under the father of the 5 sons, one Mattathias, the retired priest of the first order, who now lives in a little town called Modin, Modein, a few miles northwest of Jerusalem, we have the initial stage of the Jewish resistance movement, known as the Maccabean Revolt. Now, the Maccabees weren't the only ones involved with this. It's just that God so worked things out, and it was in the hearts of these 6 men that they were the ones really to initially lead in the Jewish resistance movement. So tonight, what we're going to have to look at it. Last week we just looked at this verse and explained that there are 2 different groups. There were the Hellenists and the Orthodox Jews in Israel. Tonight the title of the message will be the Jewish resistance movement. I want to look at, again, the early phases of it, coming right along the same time, that maybe just a little bit after the events with the family of Mattathias in 1 Maccabees 2, before next week getting to the place where we can concentrate on their early leader, Judas Maccabeus, who becomes the important leader, and it's from his nickname, remember, Maccabeus, the hammer, the carpenter, whatever that is supposed to mean, that the whole family, as well as the whole movement, as well as the whole important period in Israel's history, gains its name. Now, in verses 33 through 35, these are to be understood as coming more or less at the same time as 32b, although it's going to extend for a short period of time after that. In other words, what I'm saying is 32b just describes the very early part of the resistance movement before it becomes so general. And because it's just the beginning phase, and this is to let us know that more is to come, then it's just a general statement concerning those who know their God shall be strong and do exploits. The next few verses, from verse 33 through verse 35, are easy to understand. That's why we can probably look at them quickly tonight. They're easy to understand, but they're a little difficult to actually date. Not the beginning, but the end of the period that they cover. Now, some people have pointed out that no mention is made of the rededication of the temple, which takes place in around December, the middle of December, in 165 B.C. And that's true. There's no reference here to the rededication. Now, there's a reference to the pollution of the temple in verse 31 that happens in December of 168. And so, knowing how important that was, the profanation of the worship of God by Antiochus Epiphanes in December of 168, we also know how important the restoration of Jewish worship would be exactly 3 years later, in December of 165. Consequently, the argument would run as follows. Since we have a reference to the former of those, why not the latter? Since the latter would be the more glorious of the 2. And so one suggestion has been we don't have a reference to the rededication of the temple in verses 33 through 35 because these verses are fulfilled chronologically before the date of December of 165. Which would mean, basically, we're only talking about maybe the end of the year 164 and the beginning, or really almost all up until December of 165. That would be the only time covered in these 3 verses. That's one opinion of why we don't have a reference, and therefore that would help give us a date. In other words, the date for verse 35 would have to be somewhere earlier than December of 165, since that's the date of the rededication of the temple. And why not a reference to it? I mean, that was the beginning for the institution of the Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Lights, Hanukkah, and important items like that, so why not a reference here? Well, I don't follow that opinion. It's got a lot of logic behind it that you would guess in human reasoning that we should have a reference to the rededication of the temple, but that doesn't seem to me anyway to be an important part of the prophecy here. That's a blessing whenever it happens, but that's not the beginning really or the end of anything, because they don't really gain their independence until way down in 142 BC. So it almost would serve as a false sense of hope here. Say you're going to get your temple rededicated, and of course that'll be the end of Antiochus Epiphanes, the end of your persecutions, the end of all of your troubles, which historically was not the case at all. As a matter of fact, verses 33 through 35, as we're going to get into them here in a moment, warn of many, many persecutions. And not only warn of them, warn of the necessity of these persecutions, because the angel argues that by these persecutions, the people of God are going to be purified. They're going to be tried, and they're going to be purified. And we know that to be true in our own experience through trial and tribulation and persecution. We really wouldn't want a life, as a lot of us think that we would want, of no problems at all, because you mature and you grow stronger through the problems. As you learn to resist temptations and problems and persecutions and overcome that, it makes an individual a stronger individual. So I don't see that the inclusion of a reference to the rededication of the temple would really be an important or significant part of the prophecy. As a matter of fact, I don't think it would even be included here. That's my own thought, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. I'm followed by a lot of other people who've studied the passage as well. Therefore, concerning the date of these verses, I'm just introducing you to these verses before we look at them phrase by phrase. I would understand the verses then to carry the Maccabean Jewish struggle down to at least the death of Judas Maccabeus around 161 or 160 BC. And it could even go further. We don't know. It could even go further. But things do get better as they go along, as time goes along. It couldn't go much past that, or we're getting into good times where Israel basically is not under a period of persecution. Therefore, what would you have all of this in verse 35, the last verse for, that's talking about persecution? And it may well be, in addition to all of what I've just said, it may well be that really we're to take verse 35 as a double reference verse. Now, if that's true, then it makes it that much more difficult to know what the final date is. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at this verse. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge, to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. Well, that could, since it ties right into a study of Antichrist, beginning in verse 36 on through the end of this chapter, could be a double reference verse. And by that I would mean this would also apply to Jews during the tribulation. Some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge, to make them white. We know that's what tribulation is going to do for the surviving remnant of Israel. Even to the time of the end times would be the end of the tribulation, because it is yet for a time appointed. That would be after her period of Jacob's troubles during the period of tribulation. So if that's true, and we can understand that in a double sense, both referring to the people in the Jewish resistance movement of the 2nd century BC, as well as Jews, the remnant of Israel during the tribulation period, it makes it that much more difficult to date the end date of the first reference or the first aspect of that. Okay, do you all understand what I'm saying? I hadn't even gotten into opening the book or anything yet, and it's getting quiet out there. Hallelujah. So, maybe we should read the verses so you know what they're talking about. We're going to try to cover verses 33, 34, and 35. We have a lot of material now in Maccabees that we're going to have to just sit here and straightforwardly read it, because I think it's significant enough to do it in that fashion. Let's get verse 32, the context. This kind of introduces us. We've got the profanation of the worship of God in verse 31. And that's all been negative thus far. What happens against Israel? What happens against the Holy Covenant? Now we're going to get into some positive things after the first part of verse 32. Such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, the Hellenistically minded Jews. But the people that do know their God, not charismatics, the people who do know their God, most charismatics don't know their God. I don't even know how they can be claiming a verse like this. Shall be strong and do exploits. Well, you see, exploits is italicized, just means they'll be strong. But if you're strong, you generally do something about it. And they that understand among the people, now we got a group of understanding people, shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword. Evidently the they goes back to those who understood among the people. Yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, and by captivity, and by spoil many days. Now, does the charismatic really want to be claiming verse 32b? Because here's what's promised to you see. It's the same group of people who know their God. And they're strong and they're doing exploits. But you're also promised you're going to die a martyr's death. Either by the sword, by flame, by captivity, by spoil. I don't know which of those I would pick. Probably not the flame. That sounds pretty bad. Just get me through the heart with the sword and get it over with. Or I like the spoil. You can steal my goods, but leave me alone. Although that's really not what it means, though. It means after they kill you, then they'll take your goods. Now, when they shall fall, they shall be holpen. Oh, you say good, but only with a little help. But many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them of understanding shall fall, or back to those who understand, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it's yet for an appointed time. Okay, as we normally try to do, I take it a verse at a time, and even more minutely than that, a phrase at a time, because I know this can get a little bit difficult. Some people say hairy after a while, so we'll try to give it to you phrase by phrase so you'll have it down in your notes. Let's look at this phrase, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many. That's the first part, the first half, really, of verse 33. They that understand among the people shall instruct many. Now, this is not a reference to any formal, systematic, or organized education, such as rabbinical training or something. Those that understand among the people will instruct many. I mean, you see, we've got two groups of people, those who understand and those who don't. We've got a few who do understand. That's always true. You've got fewer that understand than those who do not understand. You've got a few who do understand among the people, and you've got many. It's called many. They're called many here, many who don't. Therefore, they will be instructed by the few who understand. So this is not a reference to any type of formal education, but to informal instruction through the various groups that spread out in Israel in the Jewish resistance movement of the 2nd century BC. These would be wise leaders, and by wise we don't mean worldly wise, we mean in the laws of Moses. Remember, that's what the whole war is about, the Jewish religion. So those who understand, that it would be understood by that that these understand the teachings, the laws, and the ways of Moses. So the few then would refer to a group of spiritually, biblically wise leaders in Israel. Let me give you a reference. 1 Maccabees 2:42 speaks of a group of these wise ones. And they, in turn, would, in an informal manner, because of these various groups spread out through Israel during the Jewish resistance movement, encourage the lay people, as it were, in the law of Moses to live accordingly. For instance, 1 Maccabees 1:29. So we see a very widespread lay movement among the people. You've got the few who do understand, and the many who do not understand are just not taught correctly in all of the precepts of Moses, and so they're not exactly for sure whether they should be surrendering or whether they should give up this item of their faith or that item of their religion. So they need to be taught. Let's look at a couple of these verses. First Maccabees 2:42, and I think I told you 129, didn't I? But I don't know why, except for that's what my notes told me to say. But I know better. 229, not 129, 229. 140 or 242. It was then that they were joined. Now we're talking about the Maccabees here. Verse 39. Great was the grief of Mattathias and his friends, although they're really not known as by this title Maccabees. Was then that they were joined by a company of Hasidians, stalwarts of Israel. Now here's some of the wise ones. Hasidians is just another way to write the Hasidim. The pious ones, we studied them in Biblical Lit just a few weeks ago. Now they were rabbinical leaders, as it were, but you don't set up, whenever your life is depending on these matters, they're not setting up schools to train potential rabbis out in the desert, in the caves or something. You do have some important pious leaders, the Hasidians or the Hasidim, stalwarts of Israel, stalwarts in the ways of the law of Moses. But they're just giving informal instruction to the people as they have questions. Remember, these leaders were known for being able to make the law of Moses contemporary for their people. And Israel really had never experienced such a time, with an onslaught in her sanctuary and her temple and being oppressed for all of these years. And how much of the law of Moses can we give up? What actually can we surrender and not sin against the law of Moses? Could we, quote, break, unquote, the Sabbath day in order to fight for our lives? Remember, the first time they were attacked, they chose not to break the Sabbath day. They all perished as a result of that. The second time that happened, Mattathias, his friend, some of the wise ones, had figured this out. Now, it's not a big deal whether we break the Sabbath or not. God's concerned about whether we survive and whether the religion of Moses and of Israel survives. So yes, we will choose to fight on the Sabbath day. There's a good example of the informal case-by-case instruction and decisions that were made by the wise people, in an impromptu manner whenever it's necessary for the people as they are spreading out through the desert. And that there were people interested in this, look at verse 29 of the same chapter. At that time, many who wanted to maintain their religion. Many, we just saw the word many also in Daniel 11 and verse 33. Many who wanted to maintain their religion. Remember, we have to get very fastidious and meticulous as we look through the books of Maccabees here. And you can find a lot of truth hidden, that corresponds with Daniel, or that we need to answer some question that's hidden somewhere in a verse in these big books of Maccabees. So, chapter 2, verse 29, at that time many who wanted to maintain their religion and law went down to the wilds to live there. So that's what we're talking about here in the first part of Daniel 11:33. They that understand among the people shall instruct many. I'm just trying to give you a picture so you know what these verses have reference to. They're very, very easy to understand. Difficult to date, but easy to understand. Okay, that's the positive part of verse 33. Let us now look at the negative, or the second part, the second half of verse 33, that reads, Yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil for many days. So what we must understand here is that they are going to be partially successful in the initial stages of the Jewish resistance movement. Informal instruction into Mosaism is spread by various leaders such as the Hasidim or the Hasidians, but it's going to both cost them their lives, they die the deaths of martyrs, as well as the many, the lay people that they instruct. So that's what I mean by partial success. Ultimately, they're going to be successful, and even that will only be temporarily. Ultimately, they'll be totally successful, but here in the beginning only partially, because in order to maintain the laws and ways of the teachings of Moses, they're going to have to give their life for it. So we're talking about the many, many martyrdoms that take place 2nd century BC in Israel. Now, it just so happens that there exist references for each of these four things mentioned, each of these specific four categories: the sword, flame, captivity, and spoil. References in the books of Maccabees, although that's really not necessary for our understanding. We could just take those as being, in other words, the general allusions to the serious straits through which the people were going. That would be depicted in terminology such as the sword, flame, captivity, and spoil. But it just so happens that we can actually find specific references to these four categories in the books of Maccabees. That's what we're going to do next then. So we're going to have an A, B, C, D, or 1, 2, 3, 4, however you're writing or numbering them along. We'll look at the sword, flame, captivity, spoil, and spend most of our time on flame because we're going to have to do a lot of reading there. Now, I do it this way so I can get a lot of material read under the proper heading there in Daniel 11. I can get a lot of material read and covered here at one time in the books of Maccabees. So for sword, we would have 1 Maccabees 2, specifically verse 38, but let's give us verses 32 through 38 for the whole context here. 1 Maccabees 2, verses 32 through 38, which, remember now, we've already read all of chapter 2, so I'm just picking verses out. I feel justified doing that now that we've read the whole chapter. Now, this little mini section is talking about evidently the first that we know of, the first attack upon some of these insurrectionists, these Jews, by the Syrians, and it results in their death because of this question of breaking the Sabbath. That was a very, very important question, obviously, in the initial phases of the war. So they were attacked and massacred on the Sabbath, men, women, and children, up to 1,000 in all, and their cattle with them. Well, how would they have been killed? Well, no doubt by sword here. 1,000 of them were killed. It takes too long to take them to the top of a mountain and drop them off head first or something. Although we're going to see where that happens as well. Evidently, they're all slaughtered by the sword, 1,000 people here who have holed themselves up in a cave somewhere out in the wilderness because of the attack of the Syrians. Okay, then secondly, we'll look at flame. You know what that means. They get burned alive even. 2nd Maccabees. Now we're going to knock out 2 chapters over in 2nd Maccabees tonight, chapters 6 and 7, which is the most important chapter there. Let's start in chapter 6, and I'll give you one verse, verse 11, and then we'll have to read the whole chapter. It deals with persecution in general that we haven't read yet. 2nd Maccabees 6:11. Other Jews had assembled in caves near Jerusalem. Now, whenever you travel over in Israel and you're out in the desert somewhere, you'll see what a verse like this is talking about. There are caves just everywhere. Especially whenever you get over on the western shore of the Dead Sea, where David evidently did a lot of his traveling and maybe wrote some of the Psalms there, where the little oasis of En-Gedi is, right there near the Dead Sea anyway, and Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and Masada, and all of that overlooks from the western side the Dead Sea, and there are lots of caves there. So evidently they're headed down somewhere in that direction. That's where David wandered and hid in caves whenever Saul pursued him, back in the books of Samuel. Other Jews had assembled in caves near Jerusalem to keep the Sabbath in secret. They were denounced to Philip and were burnt alive, since they scrupled to defend themselves out of regard for the holiness of the day. Here's another group of people that would correspond to that section in 1 Maccabees 2, verses 32 through 38. So here they are killed with fire. They're burned alive. Now, we've already covered all up through chapter 5, up through the first 2 verses of chapter 6 in our reading before of 2 Maccabees. What we have not read would be from verse 3 onward. So let's look at this. It doesn't deal like that one verse does, so much of flame, but I want to cover it here under flame or under persecution, because it evidently just refers to various persecutions in general that are going on right around the time of 1 Maccabees 2. Let me remind you of something else. Remember in 1 Maccabees 2, we actually have the account of Mattathias and his sons in Modin provoking the Syrians by slaughtering the envoy that the king sent. So you'd think, well, then the persecutions would have to begin after that. Well, yes, they would. Because look at verse 27 of chapter 5. Judas also, called Maccabeus, with about 9 others, escaped into the desert. So we know that from that verse, we know that chapter 6 of 2 Maccabees must be taking place after 1 Maccabees 2. Since Judas has already fled. As a matter of fact, evidently his father is already dead because he's not mentioned, and he was the initial leader until the last couple of verses there in chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees. Where did we read the first 2 verses? Well, back there in the Abomination of Desolations. We've got this Athenian statesman, evidently, a philosopher, who is sent by Epiphanes into Jerusalem to try to convince the Jews to give up their religion. And you have the profanation of the temple and the worship and the cessation of daily sacrifice and so on. Then verse 3, now from here on we haven't read. This evil hit them hard, Israel, and was a severe trial. Look how wicked the people are and how much wickedness is heaped up in the city. The Gentiles filled the temple with licentious revelry. They took their pleasure with prostitutes and had intercourse with women in the sacred precincts. Now this evidently was not Jews, it says Gentiles in verse 4. But this is all taking place right on the floors of the temple. They also brought forbidden things inside and heaped the altar with impure offerings prohibited by the law. Was forbidden either to observe the Sabbath or to keep the traditional festivals, or to admit to being a Jew at all. On the monthly celebration of the king's birthday, the Jews were driven by brute force to eat the entrails of sacrificial victims. Now on the feast of Dionysus, remember he's the old Greek pagan god of wine and music and revelry, they were forced to wear ivy wreaths and join the procession in his honor. At the instigation of the inhabitants of Ptolemais, an order was published in the neighboring Greek cities to the effect that they should adopt the same policy of compelling the Jews to eat the entrails and should kill those who refused to change over to Greek ways. Their miserable fate was there for all to see. For instance, 2 women were brought to trial for having their children circumcised. They were paraded through the city with their babies hanging at their breasts and then flung down from the fortifications. They were taken, in other words, up on top of a city wall, evidently, and dropped head first off. Now this all literally happened to the Jews. Then we've got verse 11. Now verses 12 through 17, a little excursion dealing with why all of this is going on. You can see here we've got the religio-homiletical aspect of the character of the author of 2 Maccabees shining forth. He says, I beg my readers not to be disheartened by these calamities. He said, in other words, because we deserve all of this, penalties because of the mistakes that we have made. Verse 17, let it be enough for me to have recalled this truth. In other words, he doesn't want people just to think God has given them up. He's saying all of this is chastisement, it's discipline for us. And if we'll endure it, if we'll go through it patiently, God ultimately will deliver us. Let it be enough for me to have recalled this truth. After this short digression, I must continue with my story. And he's going to pick out one of the teachers of the law, one Eleazar, and describe his whole martyrdom here. Just one example of many. There was Eleazar, one of the leading teachers of the law, a man of great age and distinguished bearing. He was being forced to open his mouth and eat pork. Now, you wouldn't have to force me. I like pork. But he was a Jew, though, remember. So you had to force them to get them to eat it if they were going to be Orthodox Jews. Now, we're going to get some interesting teaching. Don't just sit there and go to sleep on me. Read along here. It's very interesting what he is offered in exchange for eating pork, and he feels it'd be a compromise of his convictions, a compromise of his faith. And he said, I'd rather die than switch to your side. And then I want to conclude by saying some other things after we finish all this message that will apply it in some areas for ourselves. He was being forced to open his mouth and eat pork, but preferring an honorable death to an unclean life, he spat it out and voluntarily submitted to the flogging, beating on the back with whips and so forth. As indeed men should act who have the courage to refuse to eat forbidden food even for love of life. Now this is where it gets interesting in verse 21. For old acquaintance' sake, the officials in charge of this sacrilegious feast had a word with Eleazar in private. Now these are some of the Syrian leaders here, but they have known Eleazar and he them for quite some time. And so we're told here, for old acquaintance' sake. They are friends, although they're on opposing sides now. They don't want to see the old man die. They kind of like Eleazar, these Syrian leaders there, whoever is in charge of enforcing all of this. They're going to offer him a substitute to let him do something that no one else will know about, and then we'll let you live. And he says no. They urged him to bring meat which was permitted to eat, and that he himself prepared and only pretend to be eating the sacrificial meat as the king had ordered. In that way he would escape death and take advantage of the clemency which their long-standing friendship merited. But Eleazar made an honorable decision, one worthy of his years and the authority of old age, worthy of the gray hairs he had attained to and wore with such distinction, worthy of his perfect conduct from childhood up, but above all, worthy of the holy and God-given law. So he answered at once, send me quickly. In other words, they're going to let him, eat some chicken if he wants chicken and pretend that it is pork, and then he'll escape death. Send me quickly to my grave. If I went through with this pretense, he thinks it's a lie, it's pretense, at my time of life, then many of the young men might believe that at the age of 90, Eleazar had turned apostate. He's 90 years old here. If I practiced deceit for the sake of a brief moment of life, I should lead them astray and bring stain and pollution on my old age. I might for the present avoid man's punishment, but alive or dead, I shall never escape from the hand of the Almighty. Isn't this interesting here? He said, I'd rather die, because I can escape you anyway in death. That's what he's saying. I can get away from you if I just die, but I can't ever escape God. So if I now die bravely, I shall show that I have deserved my long life, and leave the young a fine example, to teach them how to die a good death, gladly and nobly, for our revered and holy laws. I mean, what Christian could come forth with a confession like all of that? I mean, a Christian, a modern Christian today. And this is back Jews, back whenever the canonical end to the Old Testament had already come. A couple of hundred years, over 200 years removed past that. And what a confession, what a desire to live up to the teachings of the law. When he had finished, in other words, we think this man is in the kingdom, this Eleazar, well, assuming that the story is true, and there's no reason to doubt it, why, certainly he is. He's going to obey the law to the best of his ability if it means his life. When he had finished speaking, he was immediately dragged away to be flogged. Those who a little while before had shown him friendship now became his enemies, because in their view, what he had said was madness. When he was almost dead from the blows, Eleazar sighed deeply and said, to the Lord belongs all holy knowledge. He knows what terrible agony I endure in my body from this flogging, though I could have escaped death. Yet he knows also that in my soul I suffer gladly, because I stand in awe of him. So he died, and by his death he left a heroic example and a glorious memory, not only for the young, but also for the great body of the nation. So that's worth reading in itself, even if it didn't tie in to what we're studying, and it really does, because we're talking about the initial phases. That's worth reading just of its own accord. And then we've got chapter 7. And we are going to look at this because there are New Testament references in our Bible to 2 Maccabees chapter 7. Well, let me rephrase that. Not to the chapter, but to the events that are going on in the period of the Maccabees. And it's nowhere better described in the books of Maccabees, the terrible events of persecution, than it is here in 2 Maccabees chapter 7. So because of various other extenuating circumstances, I see no reason for us not taking 2 Maccabees 6 and 7 as being true in its germ form. Whether the words are recorded accurately, whether these men, these women really said these things, really went through all that these chapters say, is really beside the point. I think in its germ form we have true accounts of what is taking place. And if we don't here, we just know from general references in 1 Maccabees, which is the more reliable of the two books, that they suffered terrible, terrible days of persecution. Whether we've got it all spelled out for us over there in the first book, like we have here in the second, is beside the point. But I want to look at this because it's the most important chapter in the books of Maccabees, most important chapter in 2 Maccabees, referred to many times down through history by Jews and by Christians. Do you remember the studies in the Apocrypha? We studied this and we concluded with pointing out things about 2 Maccabees 7. If I remember correctly, whenever we actually studied the book, chapter by chapter, I skipped over this chapter because I said we'd be to it later when we could read the entire thing, which is what we're going to proceed to do. Again, 7 brothers with their mother had been arrested and were being tortured by the king. We're talking about dying by flame now, by fire, with whips and thongs to force them to eat pork, when one of them, speaking for all, said, "What do you expect to learn by interrogating us? We are ready to die rather than break the laws of our fathers." And all the king was enraged and ordered great pans and cauldrons to be heated up, and this was done at once. Then he gave orders that the spokesman's tongue should be cut out, that he should be scalped and mutilated before the eyes of his mother and his 6 brothers. This is what's going on in this chapter. This wreck of a man the king ordered, he's still alive, to be taken, still breathing, to the fire and roasted in one of the pans. Now that's without a scalp, and that's without a tongue, and that's having your body all diced up. You're still alive. Now see, whether he was still alive, we don't know. But that's beside the point. He was murdered. He was martyred for the faith. And they're going to take him over and drop him in one of these big pans with boiling oil inside of it. As the smoke from it steamed out far and wide, the mother and her sons encouraged each other to die nobly. "The Lord God is watching," they said, "without doubt has compassion on us. Did not Moses tell Israel to their faces in the song denouncing apostasy, 'He will have compassion on his servants'?" So there's brother number 1. Brother number 2. After the first brother had died in this way, the second was subjected to the same brutality. The skin and hair of his head were torn off, and he was asked, "Will you eat before we tear you limb from limb?" He replied in his native language, "Never." And so he in turn underwent the torture. With his last breath he said, "Friend, though you are setting us free from this present life, and since we die for his laws, the King of the universe will raise us up to a life everlastingly made new." That's bodily resurrection. The liberals say, well, Israel never believed in bodily resurrection. That was an invention of Jesus and the apostles. Well, we're 2 centuries prior to Jesus and the apostles. We're not even in the Old Testament. We're in between. He said bodily resurrection. You're just delivering me from an evil life that I need to be delivered from one day anyway. So I'm just going home early, was his consideration of the whole event. And he said the King of the universe, and he's the one that we're dying for. It's his laws. He's going to raise us up. Raise us up. That's resurrection. To a life everlastingly made new. That means a new body, a new life. Resurrection from the dead, bodily resurrection. After him, the third. In other words, these aren't heretical, unorthodox people here. So it should be no surprise to us that the New Testament has some commentary on the events of the Maccabean resistance. After him, the third was tortured. When the question was put to him, he at once showed his tongue. Boldly held out his hands. You know, he said, "Here's my tongue." He wasn't sticking his tongue out at them, but saying, "Here it is. If you're going to cut it, do it now." He said courageously, I want you to really pay attention to this. This is Jews dying for the faith, and how much more should Christians be willing to die? We got a better law to die for. They're dying for the old law of Moses. Old things about you can't eat rabbits and you can't eat this. They were dying for that. Well, not that. The spiritual intent of all of it, they recognized it had to have more than just all of these legal externalisms, or who would be so foolish as to die for that. But I mean the law of Moses. We've got something so much better. It's called in Hebrews 2, so great a salvation. And a lot of people, it happened down through the centuries, whenever it came time for you to be put up on the chopping block. If you were a professing believer, you'd get up there and put your hand behind your back and cross your fingers and say, no, I'm not a believer. And whenever they let you up, then you go away snickering and laughing and see, I had my fingers crossed, I really was. Well, if you're that afraid to die for your beliefs, then they're not beliefs. It's just head knowledge that you have, just mental assent to something. And the Catholics even invented a little way to get out of all of that. They could get out of persecution that came because of their persecutions against the Protestants. But I won't go into that. His laws mean far more to me than they do. That is, his hands and his tongue. And it is from him that I trust to receive them back. Now, where did these guys get all this? I mean, they must have had a pious mother. We're not even told about their father. He evidently is dead at this time. Maybe he died in the persecutions. We don't know. We have a mother and her 7 sons, a pious mother who taught her children correctly from the law of Moses, bodily resurrection. He said, I'm going to get my tongue back and my hands back. Oh, not these. It'll be in a new form. As we read the end of verse 9, it'll be a life everlastingly that is made anew. When they heard this, the king and his followers, instead of being enraged, were amazed. First time they were enraged, but now the brothers are getting bolder and bolder. We're amazed, although he's still enraged. Amazed at the young man's spirit and his utter disregard for suffering. When he too was dead, so that means he died, they tortured the fourth in the same cruel way. And at the point of death, he said to the king, better to be killed by men and cherish God's promise to raise us again. Can you believe this teaching on bodily resurrection here? I think a whole lot of people who are even students of the New Testament don't even know this is back here in the Apocrypha. There will be no resurrection to life for you. Not to life, that is to damnation though. Because Daniel 12 verse 2 taught double resurrection. Same as Jesus' teaching in John 5. Some that will go forth to life and some to everlasting torment. Then the fifth was dragged forward for torture. Looking at the king, he said, you have authority over men, mortal as you are. You can do as you please. But do you imagine that God has abandoned our race? Wait and see how his great power will torment you and your descendants. Next, the sixth was brought. With his dying breath, do not delude yourself. It is our own fault that we suffer these things. We have sinned against our God and brought these appalling disasters upon ourselves. In other words, you could have no power over us at all except it were delivered to you from above. The mother was the most remarkable of all. Now, so far, 6 brothers. We won't get the 7th for towards the end of the chapter, but 6 brothers, 6 of her sons. She stood there and watched all of them. Could you watch your child? Well, I mean, it happened to Christians, and it's going to happen probably sometime soon, where Christians are going to be martyred again. But to think that a mother stands and watches her children being diced up and sliced up, and she's encouraging them. She's saying, this is great. Praise God. You're dying for something worthy. I mean, you can either die this way, or maybe tomorrow you'll die in a donkey accident or something out on 5th and Broad. So here's a noble way to die. You're going to die a noble way, because we're all going to have to die someday anyway. If you're going to have to die, a martyr's death sounds pretty good. But for a mother to watch all of this is something else. The mother was the most remarkable of all and deserves to be remembered with special honor. And she has been ever since then. We don't want to canonize her or anything, but she should be remembered with special honor. She watched her 7 sons all die in the space of a single day. You know, some mothers might lose a son in Korea and lose one in Vietnam. That's over a decade. She lost 7 in one day. Yet she bore it bravely because she put her trust in the Lord. She encouraged each in turn in her native language, filled with noble resolution. Her her woman's thoughts fired by a manly spirit. She said to them, "You appeared in my womb." Here's her womanly thoughts here. You know, a mother would think, this is my own child that I bore into this world and nursed and brought up. And now they're being butchered before my eyes. "You appeared in my womb, I know not how." Psalm 139, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. "It was not I who gave you life and breath and set in order your bodily frames. It is the Creator of the universe who molds man at his birth and plans the origin of all things. Therefore he in his mercy will give you back life and breath again, since you now put his laws above all thought of self." Self. Denial of self here. And she's teaching bodily resurrection. So what's Epiphanes thinking about this time? Well, he felt he's being treated with contempt and suspected an insult in her words. He suspected correctly. The youngest brother was still left, the small fry of the family. The king, not content with appealing to him, even assured him on an oath that the moment he abandoned his ancestral customs, he would make him rich and prosperous by enrolling him as a king's friend and entrusting him with high office. Since the young man paid no attention to him, the king summoned the mother and urged her to advise the lad to save his life. After much urging from the king, she agreed to persuade her son. Well, did she really? She leaned towards him, and flouting the cruel tyrant, she said in their native language, "My son, take pity on me. I carried you 9 months in the womb, suckled you 3 years, reared you, brought you up to your present age. I beg you, child, look at the sky and the earth, see all that is in them, and realize," and here remember it's creatio ex nihilo, that's taught right here in the Apocrypha, "that God made them out of nothing, that man comes into being in the same way. So do not be afraid of this butcher. Accept death and prove yourself worthy of your brother, so that by God's mercy I may receive you back again along with them."
For the
made them out of nothing, that man comes into being in the same way. So do not be afraid of this butcher. Accept death and prove yourself worthy of your brother, so that by God's mercy I may receive you back again along with them. She had barely finished when the young man spoke out, "What are you all waiting for? I will not submit to the king's command. I'll obey the command of the law given by Moses to our ancestors. And you, King Antiochus, who have devised all kinds of harm for the Hebrews, you will not escape God's hand. We are suffering for our own sins, and though to correct and discipline us for living, the Lord is angry for a short time, yet he will again be reconciled to us. But you, impious man, you foulest of the human race, do not indulge vain hopes or be carried away by delusions of greatness, you who lay hands on God's servants. You are not yet saved from the judgment of the almighty, all-seeing God. My brothers have fallen in loyalty to God's covenant, after brief pain leading to eternal life. But you will pay the just penalty of your insolence by the verdict of God." It's amazing the king let him talk this long. "I, like my brothers, surrender my body and my life for the laws of our fathers. I appeal to God to show mercy speedily to his people, and by whips and scourges to bring you to admit that he alone is God. With me and my brothers may the Almighty's anger, which has justly fallen on all our race, be ended." The king, exasperated by these scornful words, was beside himself with rage. So he treated him worse than the others, and the young man died, putting his whole trust in the Lord, without having incurred defilement. Then, finally, after her sons, the mother died. This, then, must conclude our account of the eating of the entrails and the monstrous outrages, chapters 6 and 7, that accompanied it. What are we talking about? Well, back to Daniel 11 and verse 33. There'll be a few people that are wise and teach the many people, but people from both groups, the few and the many, from the wise and the lay people, will fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, by spoil for many days. Daniel prophesied that, so we have to believe that the germ of the story here is true, because Daniel said it's going to happen. You're going to die by fire. The angels prophesy you're going to die by fire. And a lot of these guys here are dying by fire, evidently, because they're being boiled in this pot of oil. So, having read chapter 7, now you know. It's a beautiful, beautiful chapter. We don't count these as canonical or having any authority, but they should be on the shelf of a Christian, and a Christian should be familiar with the books of the Apocrypha. I won't preach that again. We preached that for a solid year about the Apocrypha. So, we come to the third thing, the sword, flame, captivity. 1 Maccabees 3 and verse 41. I said that we have verses that correspond to all of this. 1 Maccabees 3:41. The merchants of the region, impressed by what they heard of the army, took a large quantity of silver and gold with a supply of fetters and came in the camp to buy the Israelites for slaves. The army was also reinforced by troops from Syria and Philistia. They went into captivity as slaves. 1 Maccabees 3:41. And spoil, number 4, spoil, 1 Maccabees 5:13. All our fellow Jews in the region of Tubius have been massacred, their wives, their children taken captive. So you probably got sword, maybe sword and flame in massacre. Maybe just sword, but sword and flame, wives and children taken captive. You got captivity and their property carried off. You've almost got all of them here in 1 Maccabees 5:13. At least you have 1, 3, and 4. The sword, captivity, and spoil. Okay, let's go back to Daniel and get into verse 34 then, which these two verses won't take nearly as much time. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen, that is, helped, with a little help. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. So we know that we've got in 32b people that are strong and that know their God. And yet just because they're strong and know their God and God's going to be with them and they're going to do exploits and they're going to be victorious, they're only going to be partially victorious to begin with. Because of verse 33, some are going to die by these 4 different methods or 3 different methods. So verse 34 is kind of a rehashing of that. That when they're falling, which is what verse 33 says, when they're falling, they're going to have a little bit of help. So we've got passages like, again, 1 Maccabees 2 and verse 42, which I gave you earlier, where we see at first it didn't go very well for the insurrectionists. They're really falling to begin with. Many hundreds, many thousands, many tens of thousands of them, no doubt, perished. But they did more and more begin to receive small amounts of help as more people would flee from the cities and join their little groups out in the desert. That evidently is what he's talking about here. More and more they began to receive small amounts of help. You wouldn't have a whole town of 50,000 people come and live in your cave with you, but you would have small groups of people flee from the cities, flee from the influence of Hellenism that would be most pronounced in the larger cities, and they would join these various bands of people spread out in the desert. As we see the Hasidians or the Hasidim doing, 1 Maccabees 2:42, and other faithful lay people doing in 1 Maccabees 2 and verse 29. Okay, and then the end of this verse, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. Many shall cleave to them with flatteries. Perhaps this refers to traitor Jews, Syrian sympathizers. Certainly that had to take place, though only to a small degree, we would think, because of what I'm going to say here in a moment. So perhaps these that are cleaving, that is, you got some people that are leaving the towns, coming to join the Maccabees and the various associated groups out in the desert, but it says they'll cleave with flatteries. So perhaps we're to understand that to mean traitor Jews that are Syrian sympathizers. In 1 Maccabees 2:44 and 3:5, we see that as the strength of the Maccabees begins to grow, that many of the other Jews begin to fear reprisals from the hand of the Maccabees, Consequently, many of them may have joined forces just to escape the sword of Judas and his brothers. That maybe is the best explanation for what we have here. They're really not totally in favor of the Maccabees, but as you can see in 1 Maccabees 2:44 and 1 Maccabees 3:5, the Maccabees have become so strong at this time. These Jews that are still in the cities, the Maccabees are going to be wondering if they happen to come by your city why you haven't joined us out here. The Maccabees have become so strong, and the people associated with their groups, that these people still left in the towns fear the reprisals, fear the Maccabees will come and put them to the sword. We saw in chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees that Mattathias didn't hesitate to kill a fellow Jew who went forward to offer the sacrifice at the bidding of the king. If you're a Hellenistic Jew, you're going to die by the Maccabees just like if you were a Syrian. And so by flattery, by guile, they'll go over and pretend like they're on the side of the Maccabees. Although it doesn't seem like a whole lot of that happened, because the Maccabees had a very successful guerrilla war tactic, and along with that would have to come very important chains of investigation, espionage, being able to detect whenever the wrong type of people entered into your company. Verse 35, this section finally closes in on a strong spiritual note. Some of them of understanding shall fall. But all of this that is to happen concerning the persecutions, concerning the death of the people, all of this that is to happen is to try them, to purge them, and to make them white. In other words, God intends to use this for the benefit of the whole nation, that the nation as a whole was suffering for its sins, but they're going to be purged through the suffering for their sins. So there's a positive way to look at all of this, that God's people, although they're going to have difficulty, tribulation, trials, it will always be not for purposes of self-destruction of the individual, but as Hebrews 12 teaches for the Christians, it's so that we might be partakers of His holiness. Or to sum it up as the way it is here in Daniel, so that we can be purged, sifted, and whitened. Tried, purged, sifted, whitened, purified, made pure, made ready through the difficulties that we suffer. Now, in conclusion, if you'll jump with me over to Zechariah chapter 9. Zechariah 9 is a prophecy of Greece. We haven't looked at this before, just because it slipped my mind, to tell you the total truth, why I didn't come over to this, the first 8 verses particularly, whenever we were studying Alexander the Great. But evidently some of this, well, definitely, I won't say evidently, it's known to be a fact that Zechariah 9 verses 1 to 8 has reference to the times whenever Alexander was pushing his way toward the south from the north through Palestine, headed down to Egypt to conquer Egypt. And remember that not a battle was fought against Israel. He conquered all the nations around, and there was a story preserved in the writings of Josephus that is only a story, is only a myth, that whenever he came to attack the city of Jerusalem, the priest went out and showed Alexander copies of the book of Daniel, showing him that he himself, as Alexander, the son of Philip, king of Macedon, he himself was prophesied in the Jewish scriptures as being the one who would conquer the world of his day. Remember, I've told you that story before. And I've said it's only a myth. But one thing we do know is that although Alexander by battle, by force, by war conquered everyone around him, he did not conquer Israel that way. And lo and behold, look at the 8th verse, telling you, without looking at all of it now, that this is talking about Alexander. I will encamp about mine house because of the army. Alexander's army was parked right outside. Because of him, that's Alexander the Great, that passeth by, and because of him that returneth. What did Alexander do? He went down into Egypt, he turned around, and he came back north again, because he's headed over to defeat Darius III, the last of the Persian kings. It's all spelled out here. And no oppressor shall pass through them any more, for now have I seen with mine eyes. So whether that story in Josephus is true or not, it's a little iffy. We don't know about that one of the priests really took the manuscripts out. But we do know that God said, I will supernaturally be there, and Alexander will not harm the city. And that happened. Now, verses 12 through the end of the chapter refer to the period of the Maccabees. So let's read these verses. Turn you to the stronghold, ye prisoners of hope. Even today do I declare that I will render double unto thee. Persecutions of Epiphanes for Israel. So I have to give you this so you know that it does tie in here, so you got your notes complete from Bible references. When I have bent Judah for me, he's using the analogy of bending a bow and putting an arrow in it and shooting it for him. Fill the bow with Ephraim, raised up thy sons, O Zion, against thy sons, O Greece. What were the Syrians? They were Greeks, were they not? Yes, they were Greeks. And made thee as the sword of a mighty man. And the Lord shall be seen over them, and his arrow shall go forth as the lightning. The Lord God shall blow the trumpet, and shall go with whirlwinds of the south. Now, a lot of symbolism used here, but it's talking about what we just were talking about in Daniel. The Lord of hosts shall defend them. They shall devour and subdue with sling stones, and they shall drink and make a noise as through wine. They shall be filled like bowls, and as the corners of the altar. And the Lord their God shall save them in that day as the flock of his people. For they shall be as the stones of a crown, lifted up as an ensign upon his land. For how great is his goodness, and how great is his beauty. Corn shall make the young men cheerful, and new wine the maids. Now let me explain to you why I'm turning over here, and there's a parallel to this over in the New Testament. Of course, Daniel's a parallel to all of this. See if I can think of a way I want to explain this. It's very interesting to me. As a matter of fact, well, we've gone an hour, but I'm going to have to keep teaching in this area because I want to go and explain all this. This really, to me anyway, is one of the basic reasons I would want to know what's going on in the period of the Maccabees. All that's taking place there, what's taking place, why it's taking place, when it's taking place, who is involved in the taking place of the events there. There's something very interesting to me. I think I've shared this in general with you before. We know that at the Old Testament, the canonical period of Revelation, let's just give it a general date, closes around 400 BC. We'll just give that generally for the end of the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. That's the end. That's the conclusion. And for some reason after that, Israel, we kind of don't know what happens to Israel. She doesn't just vanish from history. But I wonder if you have noticed in all these studies so far in intertestamental period class that once we got through discussing Assyria, Babylon, then the Greeks, or really the Medes and the Persians, and we didn't get that far into the Greeks. Once, in other words, we got down to around 400 BC. When we got past that, what do we start dealing with? Daniel 11. And what does that deal with? The kings of the north and the kings of the south. And how do they interact with Israel during those early years? We don't know. If you remember, we studied week after week after week, some Ptolemy, some Seleucid, one of the kings, and how did they relate to Israel back in the early stages? We don't know because very, very little is known about Israel's history. Very little is known about the history that's reliable from, let's say, 400 down to 200, a 200-year period there. Once we start with Maccabees, once we start with what's going on here in the book of Daniel, once we start with what's going on here in Zechariah 9, from there on down to the birth of Christ, their history is fairly well documented. We basically know from the books of Maccabees as well as from other sources, whenever we begin to have interaction with the new Mediterranean Roman Empire, we know what's going on. We know what's taking place. Going back to what I started to say, whenever this period of canonical revelation comes to an end, 400 BC, then it was always my concern, what happened to Israel then? Whenever we study the Bible, I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well. I probably will by the time I get through, but you listen to what I'm saying. Whenever we study the Bible, we look at someone like a Miriam or a David or an Isaiah just as someone that's just out of this world, unordinary, extraordinary, spiritual person, just out of this world. then what happens once you close the period of biblical revelation, Old Testament 400 BC, and you get into talking about Judas Maccabeus or something? Well, he's a nobody. That's only because we don't find him back in the pages of the Bible, that he's a nobody. He's just someone who came after the biblical time. Therefore, it was always my thought, well, how concerned was God, if he was at all, of the people of Israel between Malachi and Matthew in the order of our English Bible during that 400-year period? And I'm saying that because then I would take that and move that to the end of the book of Revelation and say, now, what is God's thought? How concerned is God about his people once the first century comes to a close? Because my point is, we know after that, all type of mysticisms and superstitions end up in the church. And it looks like the whole church just falls away and becomes apostate. Now, what does that mean then? Does that mean that God's eye is not on his church? Were there any true people, the 2nd century, the 3rd, the 4th, who believed God, who believed the way we do, who followed some semblance of the teachings of the apostles in the New Testament? Well, I guess to answer that question, to me anyway, since we know we've got an old and a new, and we know we've got a period of silence after the old, before the first advent of Christ, and a period of silence after the new, before the second advent of Christ, to answer that, you'd first of all have to answer the first part of the question. Was God concerned at all about Israel between the Testaments? In other words, did God look down somewhere in the pages of the Old Testament? Can we see that God is looking down in history between that little vacuum of time and of space, between Malachi and Matthew, and he saw his people? They were going to be faithful. They were going to be Hellenists then, but they were going to be faithful people then as well, upon whom God's eyes would be, and upon whom his concern and his mercy would be, and concerning whom prophecies had been given back in the Old Testament. If you remember, and you might not, but it's been some time ago, a few months, a year, a couple of years, I don't remember, but I remember coming here one time, I think it was when we were meeting here in this building, and I said there was something that I wanted to know about, and I was seeking the Lord, and I wanted revelation about it. A lot of people pray about, this, that, or the other, but I wanted some understanding. I had to have some proof for it, and it concerns what I'm talking to you about right now. And because I began to see these things, like in Zechariah 9, how God's predicting all of this, as well as Daniel. I was familiar with that in Daniel, but Daniel and now Zechariah 9, that God saw his people down between the Testaments after the end of the revelation of the Old Testament. And there were still people who were Jews, just like there were Jews back in biblical days. It's just that the Bible is such a holy book, we think of all of the people in its pages as only holy people. And if you come outside of the pages of the Bible, well, you just can't compare that. The Bible is just unique, and all the people there are unique. And of course, then the same thing would be said of Christians today. Well, we're really not like the Christians of the first century because they were more holy because their names got in the Bible. Or at least they're a reference to them as the people of God or the body of Christ or the church or the assembly made it into the Bible. But where do we stand? Are we part of the true church today? Were the Maccabees part of the true Israel of their day? Obviously they were. Not only did they prove it, I guess we see two things here. Not only did they prove it by their life. You can't just say, well, I'm a Jew. You have to prove it. You can't say you're a Christian. You have to prove it by your life. Not only did they prove it by their life, but they were prophesied in Scripture as being those who would exist down to that day, and who would be true and who would be faithful to the Lord. Now, with that in mind, look what we've got here in verse 14 and verse 16. Now, let me say another comment about Zechariah 9. I don't want to get into teaching Zechariah 9, but we have to go through this phrase by phrase as well. Many people believe, and I just will have to admit I'm not for sure if I'm convinced one way or the other. I guess I'm more convinced of the way I'm going to share that some people believe, that we've got a double prophecy here in these verses, verses 12 through 17. That some of the language used here is of such a supernatural character that it may not be fulfilled until tribulation, whenever God fights for Israel. Such as, look at verse 14. the Lord shall be seen over them. Now, how literally are we to interpret that and understand that? That we're actually going to see God, or maybe that could mean the angels of God's presence that represent God fighting over the people? Well, I don't doubt that something like that is going to happen for Israel in the last days. We even find in Zechariah 14 that the Lord God himself will come and fight for Israel as he did in the day of battle. He will come and fight. We have no references that are reliable to God or the angels actually being seen, for instance, by the Syrians fighting over Israel this day. So on the basis of something like that, the first part of verse 14, it may be well to think of this as being fulfilled partially anyway in the end times. I could even get off into some other side stories, but I think I'll probably save those in their intent anyway, concerning the various recent Arab-Israeli wars, in the last couple of decades. I've got reports at home that are from unbelievers, that are from some of the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Lebanese that were involved in fighting Israel, that they saw heavenly beings on the wings of the fighter jets of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. They actually saw manifestations of the presence of God in the form of his holy messengers fighting on behalf of Israel. Well, with a verse like Zechariah 9:14, I don't doubt that at all. Whether that's really the end total fulfillment, that's the literal fulfillment of this, or that is just the earnest of the fulfillment that will yet come, I don't know. I tend to believe the latter of those. That something like that, if it has happened, granted that it has, it's just the earnest, just the down payment for what God is going to do for Israel in the last days. But then we've got verse 16 as well, that the Lord their God shall save them in that day. Now the Maccabees, notice they're fighting hard. And something else that's interesting, another point of analogy here is that we don't have reference to miracles taking place. Whenever God fought for Israel back in Moses' day, it was with parting of the Red Sea, plagues and so forth. Now it's with the guerrilla tactics that are developed under Judas Maccabeus. God is using their own tactics, and as a result of that, the Scriptures can say that God is fighting for them. So, then you ask the question, well, are miracles for today for the Christian then? God used certain things in the New Testament, and then today he works in other ways. The Lord their God shall save them in that day as the flock of his people, for they shall be as the stones of a crown lifted up as an ensign upon his land. And then, surprise of all surprises, if you'll turn over to Hebrews 11, you may have already guessed that I'll be going to Hebrews 11 when I said New Testament references to the period of the Maccabees. But I don't know anyone who's knowledgeable who doesn't hold to this view. And what's that? That view is that from verse 33 through verse 40, the Maccabees and the Jews who are part of the resistance movement of that period are on again, off again mentioned. The end here of Hebrews chapter 11. Now, this is one of the early apostles writing the book of Hebrews. Whoever that might be, it's one of the early apostles. And although we cannot conclusively prove, and we've studied a couple of messages before, the alleged references in the New Testament to some passage in the Apocrypha, we can't prove that there's any immediate connection between any verse or passage in the New Testament with a verse or a passage in the book of anywhere in the Apocrypha. We can say, and it is safe to say, that these are general allusions back to the whole period in the beginning of the 2nd century BC in Israel. And what's interesting is they're made by an apostle, and it made it into the New Testament. I guess the reason I'm laboring this so much is because it's real easy, if you're from a Protestant background, just to think anything related to the Apocrypha or Maccabees somehow is apostate, that God wasn't concerned about them at all, and that all those are fanciful tales and notions and so forth. That simply is not true. First Maccabees is the best book of the Apocrypha. Second Maccabees is good as long as it corresponds to First Maccabees and doesn't get over into religious aspects of things. When it teaches the truths from a historical point of view, then as far as we know, it's reliable. Now, from verse 3 through verse 31, again, I don't want to get into a teaching on Hebrews 11, but I have to share this so you can see the outline. From Hebrews 11:3 through 31, everything is given to us chronologically. It's all in order. That's important to know to begin with. We have the creation, verse 3, Abel, verse 4, Enoch, verse 5, Noah, verse 7, Abraham, verse 8, then Sarah, then Isaac, verse 20, Jacob, 21, Joseph, 22, Moses, 23, the children of Israel, 28 through 29, Rahab, 31. You see, all that's right in order. It's all properly in order. Then we get into, well, verse 32 just kind of sums up. He says, what more shall I say? Time would fail me to tell you of all the exploits of the various people of the Old Testament. He mentions some: Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Now, is that in order, just looking at that verse? Well, we got David before Samuel there. And when you get into verses 33 through 40, it seems like he has dropped the idea of going strictly in chronological order. You have to know that to understand what I just said a moment ago, that on again, off again, we see the Maccabees in these verses. We'd like it just to be able to find one verse that's talking about them. Well, there are allusions in several verses spread out here. Let's take a look at what those might be. Who through faith subdued kingdoms. That could be, the Maccabees. They subdued the Syrian kingdom. But that's, pretty vague. That could be almost anybody. So that's pretty vague. Wrought righteousness, that could relate to them. Obtained promises, that could obtain to them. They obtained the promises of Daniel 11 and Zechariah 9. Stomped the mouths of lions. Now that sounds like Daniel there. Quenched the violence of the fire. That sounds like Daniel's three friends. So see, we're out of chronological order when you get to the end of the chapter. Escaped the edge of the sword. That could be a whole lot of people. Out of weakness were made strong. Waxed valiant in fight. Turned to flight the armies of aliens. Now we're definitely talking about the period of the Maccabees. And we haven't gotten into a study of Judas Maccabeus yet, which we will next week. But they did that very thing. Our whole armies would come out after them, and they would surprise them, and because of their boldness, he'd go with a handful of men and attack a whole army. He'd turn to flight the armies of aliens. There's no doubt in my mind that verse 34 has a reference to the period of the Maccabees. Verse 35 seems like now we jumped way back to Elijah and Elisha's time. Women received their dead raised to life again. Remember, Elijah and Elisha performed that miracle. Gave women's children back to them. But what about the end of the verse? Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. 2 Maccabees 7, could you ask for a clearer reference? They offered them deliverance. Eleazar in 2 Maccabees 6, they offered him deliverance. Others were tortured. What's your reference there? Acts 22:25? How in the world could that be? I don't know who that person was asleep when he put that reference in there. This is the heroes of the Old Covenant. This isn't the New Testament. I don't know how that made it in there, but you can mark that out. You can put 2 Maccabees in there instead of Acts. Do you have Acts 22:25? By tortured? Well, what a foolish soul. Someone should torture the soul that put that in there. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. What was the whole thing we labored over there? Resurrection. They believed in bodily resurrection. There's going to be two of them, a better one and a worse one. The worse one sends you to the underworld. The better one sends you to the world above. There's no doubt in my mind this is a reference to the events of 2 Maccabees chapter 7. Which is one reason I believe what 2 Maccabees gives me, at least in its germ form. I have no reason to question it or doubt it. There's nothing heretical there. There are other things in the book I question in 2 Maccabees, like prayers to the dead and prayers for the dead. I question that, prayers by the dead. But 2 Maccabees 7, being tortured, there's one part of it. You're offered deliverance, there's a second part. You turn it down, there's a third part. The fourth part is a reason why, so that you can obtain a better bodily resurrection. Well, did you ever see that verse there? No, that's talking about Maccabees. Or not the Maccabees, evidently to 7 sons and their mother, as well as other people like Eleazar. Others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. That could well be taking place during this period as well. What's a reference there? Genesis 39? That's probably way too long ago. Jeremiah 20? That could be. Could be Jeremiah. It's getting late enough in history. Jeremiah was put into bonds and imprisoned because of old Pashur one time, or happened to him several times. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder. Legend holds that was fulfilled with Isaiah. They were tempted, they were slain with the sword. That was the first of the 4 categories in Daniel 11 and verse 33. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts, mountains, dens, caves of the earth. It's exactly where all these people were. Now look what it says of them. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God, that is the promise of the Messiah, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Now, how do you like that? I mean, that revolutionizes my way of thinking about things. Whenever the Lord began to open all this to me, I had to see it from the Scriptures. In comparing the end of the Old Testament, the end of the New, and the likelihood of there being true believers today on the order of the believers of the New Testament. Because guess what? I mean, he's given us verses 1 through 38, and then the last 2 verses sum it up. These all, having obtained a good report through faith. That means that these 7 sons, their mother, Judith Maccabeus, his brothers, their father, Mattathias, are all put on the same level, in the same category with Abraham, Enoch, Abel, Joseph, Isaac, Jacob, Rahab, David, Samuel. See, a biblical proof. You have to have proofs for these things. That's what I'm always wanting, a proof in the Bible. But notice how much you have to know to end up with a proof like this. Because I've always hypothesized and philosophized with myself about these people out there that call themselves Christians, and we who call ourselves Christians, and where are times like they were right in Bible days, right in the days of the Bible? Well, you don't have to have times like were right in the Bible to be a person that's on the same order of the people like Mary, John Mark's mother in Acts 12 that had a prayer meeting in her home all the time, and the other people that are mentioned in the New Testament. It answers it as far as I'm concerned. Maybe you've never thought about this as deeply as I have and worried over it and wondered over it and prayed about it. And it wouldn't therefore tonight maybe have as big an impact on you as it did on me whenever these things began to be opened up to my eyes. But he sure answered all of my questions about Jews in between the Testaments, that there were faithful ones all along. We don't know about them, we don't hear about them until something big happens, like the books of Maccabees. And even there, it doesn't mean they're without blemish or without fault, but neither was Abraham, though. Neither was David. Neither was Noah without blemish or without fault. But they all obtained a good report through the faith, and it's always back to the Word of God. It's always back for them, the Maccabees, the law of Moses, what's written in the law, what's written in the law, what's written in the law, because of the faith they had in the Word of God. And of course we know the whole theme of Hebrews chapter 11, because they were willing to do something about their faith. Sometimes we call it act upon one's faith. But you notice there's not a single example of dead faith in Hebrews 11. Dead faith, remember it's James 2, faith without works is dead. Not a single example of dead faith. By faith Abel offered something. By faith Enoch walked with God. By faith Noah built an ark. By faith, you see, it's always action. You're always doing something. By faith Abraham went out somewhere. By faith Jacob blesses. By faith the children of Israel go around the walls of Jericho. By faith they go through the Red Sea. By faith, Rahab hides the two spies in Joshua chapter 2. It's always by faith they did something. For the Maccabees, it's the same thing. They're not sitting idly by saying, well, Lord, fulfill Daniel 11 and Zechariah 9. Let your power be seen over us and deliver us and fight against our enemies. They're out there fighting. They're busy doing something. And they don't have some little formula memorized about acting upon my faith. If it's a living faith, and you'll have living actions that go along with it. They just come out of you. Because you believe it, you do something about it. The Maccabees are like that. Christians today, yes. If you look over in conclusion, see, I'm trying to tie this into a lot of other things. But you have to. Where else could you teach something like this without having done all this study about Daniel chapter 11? Revelation chapter 3, verses 13 through 22. Revelation 3, verses 13 through 22. Yes, there are going to be Hellenistic Christians today and Orthodox ones today. And those that are of a Hellenistic mind, by that I mean they are corrupted by the ways of the world, then God gives them the opportunity to repent and to change their ways. But we see that there will be some that aren't corrupted by the ways of the world, just like there were for the Maccabees. Not corrupted totally like so many people are. And I mentioned Revelation 3 in a message, or not in a message, but in a little sharing session not long ago. He that hath ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the angel of the church of the Laodiceans. We all know about this passage, the old lukewarm Laodicean church. These things saith the Amen, the faithful and the true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. Doesn't that sound like our church today? Not our church, but I mean the church today. Let me clarify that. Sounds like the church today. They're not hot, they're not cold. They're not just terrible, are they? No. But they're not heavenly, are they? No. They're kind of in between somewhere. And Jesus prophesied this would happen. We'll explain more about that when we study the 7 churches here. Were they 7 literal churches? Do they represent 7 successive ages of church history where each age will be characterized by the certain things that are specified here? Or could both of those things be true? Well, I think I'm telling you enough to know at least the latter of those is true, that yes, we're in an age of church history that could be referred to as the Laodicean church period, where the church is characterized by lukewarmness. We see from verse 17 it's characterized by materialism. I am rich and increase with goods and have need of nothing. Well, that's our church. I forget how many billions of dollars are pumped into religious institutions today. They say they're always in need of money, but really they're not. They got billions of dollars in the churches out there. And what about the charismatic movement with her influence and her teaching upon materialism? Materialism. I am rich, increase with goods, and have need of nothing. And knowest not that thou art wretched, and miserable, and poor, and blind, and naked? I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich. In other words, there's a possibility of these people changing. See, I was part of a lukewarm church. It was a lukewarm professing believer at one time. I was part of the Laodicean age. And I mean, I still am as far as living during that period. But Jesus, if he's giving them a warning, then it means it's possible for some people to heed the warning then. And of course, we know it's possible for some not to. In other words, I'm saying this to me is on exactly the same order as Daniel 11, Zechariah 9, Hebrews 11, and the times of the Maccabees. I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, that is, have true riches, and white raiment, and so forth. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Be zealous, therefore, and repent. Christ recognized what the church would be at this latter stage. And he loves the church nevertheless. Or he wouldn't be given. He wouldn't say right here, as many as I love. He loves the lukewarm church of our day nevertheless. That's a big revelation. But it's true, according to Revelation 3. He loves the old denominational system out there nevertheless. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Be zealous, therefore, and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come in to him and will sup with him, and he with me. To him that overcometh. Now this must refer to people who are heeding his warning to the Laodicean spirit and age here. Because they're overcoming. To be an overcomer, to overcome, you have to have something to overcome. Overcoming this spirit of complacency and materialism in the Laodicean church age. To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame, and am set down with my Father in his throne. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the assemblies. Well, I hope this kind of helps to open your eyes in some areas. We're tying it into ITP class, but it's really getting into preaching material here to help open your eyes to a different and maybe a more biblical conception of things as they exist today. And if you're not following all of what I'm saying, get the tape and get into it some more, and maybe you'll get thinking along the same train of thought that I am, because I just think that I know the way things are presented well enough to know that most people's conception of someone like a Judas Maccabeus is someone that went to hell. So they might be surprised if he were in heaven. A Judas Maccabeus, or this woman and her 7 sons. Well, that's just a Catholic Bible there. Well, that's a naive way to push those things off. Maybe things like this, I mean, why is the Apocrypha and those books of Maccabees, why have they become so influential, and why were they left around by God, just left here for so long? But that maybe they hold some type of key, whether you want to count it a small or a large one, some type of key to help our understanding of the times of Christianity after the close of the first century. You know, concerning whether Christianity even existed. I mean, you look at churches out there, and they don't look like they're Christian churches. They don't look like the New Testament. But yet there's still the possibility in change. Look at you, look at me. There's a possibility of change just for those that will heed the warning whenever the warning is preached. There were some wise ones, a Hasidim, a few that went out and shared the word with the many people. And only those who would hear the words of the few wise ones that were sent out were brought into the fold of the Lord. Sometimes it cost them their life, as well as the leaders, the Hasidim or the Hasidians themselves. But they were brought into the fold, protected during that period. Even if they did die, through it all, they're sifted, purged, made white, purified, weighed in the balances, all the excess burnt or stripped off of them. All of this that we read about here in verses 17 and 18 of Revelation chapter 3. Maybe, you could have a lukewarm period of Israel then. And a couple of people decided to do something about it, and then it just spread into a movement to do something about what we see taking place in Israel. Now, I don't mean to suggest that every little thing then or today could find a parallel vice versa. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm not suggesting that they didn't see miracles, so we can't see miracles today. I just mentioned that, but I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting that there seems to be some overall parallel between what we see today, how it seems like Christianity doesn't even exist anymore the way it did in the Bible, what we see during the period of the Maccabees, where for them they could think, well, it's all gone, it's all done, it's all over with the law of Moses, the last of the prophets, Ezra, Nehemiah, Malachi, now it's all over with. It wasn't. That was the period of biblical canonical revelation. But God never gave up on his people, though. And his people never gave up on God. That is, some of them, they continued right on down. Or how do we end up with a Mary and a Joseph and a Zechariah and Elizabeth in Luke chapters 1 and 2? To be used of the Lord to bring Jesus and John into the world, to bring us Christianity. Had to be people all along. Well, praise God. Hallelujah. I preached myself happy tonight, as some people say, even on a topic like that.